Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, depending on where you are. I'm delighted to welcome you all in this very first 2016 Risk and Management webinar. My name is Albarina, the Account Manager for Risk and Management in PECB and the organizer of this webinar. Today's topic will be on foundations of risk management, explaining principles and culture, which will be presented by Joshua Rey Albarina, leading PECB certified ISO 31000 2009 risk manager in the Philippines. Nowadays, companies increasingly are focusing more on identifying risk and managing them before they even affect the business. The ability to manage risk will help companies act more confidentially on future business decisions. To find out much more and ask your questions regarding of ISO 31000, today's webinar will cover the following: the principles of risk and management as defined in ISO 31200 2009, elicit the factors in defining the organization's risk culture, and review the succeeding steps on implementing the risk management framework and its upfront challenges of organization. Before Josh begins his presentation, I would like to ask the audience to please write down any questions you may have during the webinar in the chat box on your control panel, and we will respond to a few of them at the end and answer the remaining through email. Thank you very much for your attention and enjoy the session. Josh, you may begin the presentation.
All right, thank you, Alba, and good day, everybody, regardless of the location. Allow me to, and welcome to this webinar on Foundations in Risk Management Principles and Culture. Just a bit about me. I represent here, actually, as you can see here in my profile, I am Senior Consultant for ISO programs of SAS Management in the Philippines. We're one of the leading management consulting companies here in the Philippines, and my areas of expertise are focused on sustainability practices, energy and in the environment, organizational resilience, it's in the areas of business continuity, asset and risk management, and in business excellence, it's for a bit, it's quality and Six Sigma and IT practices, particularly on information security and IT governance. So that's a bit about me. If you want to get to know more about me, feel free to drop an email or send me a call or leave a message on my social network accounts. I'm very eager to communicate with you guys. So at least you'll get also these slides at the end of this webinar. But meanwhile, going to today's discussion, we'll be talking about the foundations of risk management and basically the principles and culture behind it. So lately, we talk about, as observed, we've heard a lot of many practitioners. When we talk about risk management, we always talk about risk assessment methodologies, how do they approach in that, and how risk management is implemented within the organization, or should we say to the conglomerates in particular. And so much that we forgot to stick to the basics, which focuses on understanding what makes the reasons behind why do this risk management exist. Now, we all know the story behind it for a few, but for those who have just started implementing risk management for the first time, it's like asking themselves, where did it start? So this webinar serves as an eye-opener to most starting up practitioners, and for those who are about to experience, for those who have already experienced or practiced risk management, this is more like a refreshing experience or a refresher on things that really count or that adds weight on why we do risk management. So with this 1-hour session, we have this. We begin with understanding the context of the organization and the in-depth understanding of a risk-oriented culture, and then we proceed with eliciting the 11 principles of risk management. We're going to go in-depth a closer look. And by the way, these 11 principles are found exclusively on the ISO 31000 2009 guideline. And finally, internalizing these principles, of course, a little bit of explanation about some of these, some context, so that for us to internalize these principles, the main flow or the main directive for understanding these principles is for us to move forward and understand, as risk practitioners, what would be the challenge for me up ahead in order to create a catalyst for change for organizations to build a level of resilience that that will create eventually value to the enterprise, more particularly to to things that really matter, in this case the people working behind it, and for us to basically answer the question where to begin. That being said, let's talk about the enterprise in a nutshell. So when you talk about the enterprise in a nutshell, I'm also referring to an organization, I'm also referring to a business and how things run on a regular basis. So as a practitioner, you as a consultant, you go to a company, you try to understand the context, you understand how things operate, and then with respect to a certain guideline, you try to look to bridge the gap or try to find the gaps and then bridge them, define a solution, make an implementation strategy, and make sure that at the end of a perfect implementation, they check it out properly. So that typically dictates how an enterprise integrates a standard or a practice. But any enterprise or any company is not without a process, and that is pretty obvious. And to start with, let's begin with an organization defined in the form of sort of say a process or an activity or process blocks, so to speak. So as an organization, defining the process itself, it has its corresponding inputs, or should we say a business requirement. And then along with how they operate, depending on products and services they provide, they provide the expected outputs. Along with it, of course, some waste and excesses or unwanted things, or something that the organization can somehow look forward to manage. But as ideal as it seems, sometimes we also see some level of inconsistencies or inaccuracies, and that for one reason, there exists what we call controls. And these controls facilitates how we define our inputs, how we define our process, or how do we define the outputs, or something that could keep us at bay with what is expected from the organization. Now, this block basically completes the entire recipe or elements of a process and control. Now, on a larger scale, while this happens, it's not at all cases it is perfect, as we also see in internal and external factors taken into full consideration, and there are several uncertainties that needs to be managed. For that reason, there should be a level of contingencies, and which is properly defined according to the risk management of the company. And while risk assessment methods follow a practical approach based on global frameworks like the COSO, and in this case the ISO 31000, across various types of risks, for example, strategic, financial, operational, and compliance, how it creates value to the organization is as dependent as to how they recognize the significance of this practice. In a similar fashion, the whole process, while ideal, is only as dependent as to how the resources are managed, preferably its people, through the organizational culture. And such is influenced according to its character, based on his behavior, and that is dictated by his attitude. And from an individual context, organization principles, when communicated properly, basically influences attitude, behavior, and eventually its character, and that which influences the organization's culture and how the company's strategic goals will be met. And from an individual's attitude, regardless of which context, it is highly influenced according to the principles he adheres. And by practice is quite an investment. One reason why companies reasonably consider allocating its resources to holistically develop its people. Now, principles, along with policies and frameworks, while it influences individuals within the organization, it also influences the entire organization, and that is why for management systems and other best practices, the principles along with policies dictates the direction and its approach to its implementation as much as the frameworks guide the organization to effectively comply with its requirements. And as principles are enablers discussed earlier in the previous slide, in this upcoming slide, as you can see here, it's a very familiar picture when you're able to have a hold on the ISO guideline. As principles are enablers discussed in the previous slide, the tone of the discussion focuses on understanding the justifications on why enterprises needs to have a risk management adapted within the organization across all management levels. While it is understood that there are a number of frameworks to select and methodologies to develop the risk management program within the context, the guidelines concept is meant to be simple, universal, and spontaneous to appreciate its importance, prompting enterprises to adapt the practice while adapting to the evolving economic landscape and innovation within the company's process and technologies. Here, the slide, which was taken from the guideline, illustrates a recommended framework on enterprise risk management in a holistic approach, regardless of which sector one comes from. This popular section of the framework occurs in the third block, which is the risk assessment methodology on the ISO 31000. Seen in this third block, you see here, this is called as the risk assessment. While the first two talks about the principles and the framework. And as per update, this guideline has already commenced revision and will be subject for release in the year in 2017. Until then, they will be providing some updates as to what are the developments of this standard. And before we skip in, before starting with the principles, if we look at this framework, everything begins with a set of principles, sort of a startup seed of thought. And then when these principles are well internalized within the organization, then it follows down to how will these principles be cascaded down to the organization. So strategically, the organization will have to create a method or a framework or a management program to make sure that all possible uncertainties that can be found, regardless of the context, is explicitly interpreted. So for that reason, there should be a level of an activity. This is found in the risk assessment process. And these three blocks constitute basically the standard itself. So for this lecture, we talk about the 11 principles. And let's begin with principle number 1. Risk management creates and protects value, and that they ensure all businesses are realized the way it is planned. Now, as principles are enablers discussed in the previous slide, the tone of this discussion focuses on, I have to, just a bit, okay. Risk management contributes to the demonstrable achievement of objectives and improvement of performance in, for example, human health and safety, security, legal and regulatory compliance, public acceptance, environmental protection, product quality, project management, efficiency in operations, governance, and reputation. Now, how is that possible? Let's take the case of manufacturing companies practicing the environmental management system or any environmental best practices an organization can adopt. Now, for all listeners, while we talk about management system, being aware that when we talk about risk management, there are many forms of risk management cases. Like we can talk about financial risk management, compliance risk, and enterprise risk management as a whole. In this case, we're taking risk management in a very holistic approach. So regardless of which industry you come from, they still speak of the same context. They still speak of the same approach. Now, in this case, we'll take this for this principle for purposes of explanation. Let's take an example of a manufacturing company, and as to how this principle will be internalized, or how can this create value to the company in effect to implement or to meet their strategic objectives. Now, during the planning phase, the team is expected to identify the impacts for each environmental aspects within the given context that is subject for the establishment of the system. We all know that. And as per ISO's Annex SL, specifically in Clause 6.1, one must identify uncertainties that can affect the program's success, be it a positive risk, negative risk, or neutral. Now, taking the example of using aerosols with traces of composition of methylene dichloride, well, this is very popular for plastic injection companies where they have to really take off the molded item off of the mold. So methylene chloride is one of the trace ingredients used to easily just take it off for another cycle to run. Now, as much as methylene dichloride is by process effective and provides good results, this is also a classified carcinogen, or simply put, a cancer-causing agent based on recorded information from MSDS and other reliable knowledge repositories. To employees exposed to it, though, if the organization's EMS is to reduce environmental impact using alternative chemicals to avoid the use, such factors like the variance of its operational cost based on the alternative chemicals priced in the market, depending on the company's risk thresholds based on its profile, it can affect the company's performance to EMS as well, more importantly, in its operations. So that is for the context of a manufacturing, of principle number 1 for manufacturing companies. Now, let's talk about next principle, integral part of all organizational process. This picture you can see, and I've personally picked this one as an orchestra because this basically, or should we say, interprets exactly how Principle 2 is presented. And in an orchestra, we all know each of these individuals has a role to perform. Now, in the same context, each of the departments has a role to perform, but carefully done to make that right output. Well, in this picture, you have to make the right sound. Now, analogous to the picture on the slide, each department in an organization, regardless of the scope of the company's business goals and objectives, they all have a role to play. While effectively planning the tactics and activities based on the strategy, it's also about asking, how can a department achieve the defined objectives as exact as it should be? Well, for most finance institutions, where risk management comes as a separate entity, the nature of its activities will encompass the enterprise, preferably in its products and services, given the cash flow's volatile nature and its significant value to the enterprise and in overall the economy. Then we now proceed to the third, which is risk management is part of the decision making. It is not a standalone activity that is separate from the main activities and processes of the organization. Risk management is part of the responsibilities of management and an integral part of all organizational processes, including strategic planning and, for some cases, change management processes. Now, okay, oh, sorry, that should not be the case, but rather it's this. It helps decision makers make informed choices, prioritize actions, and distinguish among alternative courses of action. Now, a school of fish in a bowl on one side, while they share the same resource, may change situations depending on the context, regardless if it is internal or external. Depending on the defined priorities, one can make a wise decision, but how wise can it be? Managing risks by its nature tells the decision maker to rationalize over a given situation while relying on instinct and gut feel, which oftentimes can help, especially when it comes to sudden disruptions due to encountered threats within the enterprise. In the case of business continuity, a sound business continuity plan is as good as how risks were managed due to size threats. The ability of an enterprise to jump to conclusions and decisions can affect the business, either way. However, when based on risks, there is a level of confidence and predictability which in turn benefits the enterprise in various aspects. Moving on to the principle number 4, risk management explicitly addresses uncertainty. You all know this picture. This is taken from NASA's New Horizons project. Well, I took this as an illustration, crediting to NASA, of course, for the story behind how it came to being. Now, in this principle, risk management explicitly takes account of uncertainty, the nature of that uncertainty, and how it can be addressed. Now, for this example, the NASA's New Horizons, it's basically answering a simple question over a 3 billion mile distance, 26 years in the making, 10 years of travel. What does Pluto look like? Now, in that case, despite the fact that it was more of a science mission, every step was identified, analyzed, evaluated, treated, and anticipated any possible scenarios or different extents to gather scientific data that will change the course of history. Now, when it comes to scientific data, especially for companies where metrics are the nature of their business, like testing, measurement, verification, and business analytics, any form of uncertainty can be translated into scientific or mathematical guesses, or in some ways predictable guesses such as hypotheses or inferences, verified through a scientific method. Regardless if the approach of solving it is long or next to impossible, the method aims to determine and define the unknowns and see if the results validate one of the stated hypotheses. Now, in a similar way, risk management explicitly addresses uncertainty given a proper approach. And as in most companies where all activities were managed to deliver results, it can be explicitly done through a tangible approach. And moving on, we have principle number 5. Management is systematic, structured, and timely. Now, having a system and, of course, that delivers timely results and it has a structured approach, especially in implementing risk management, we all know, obviously, that it will contribute to efficiency and to consistent, comparable, and reliable results. Now, with respect to other frameworks on risk management, the guideline provides a level of organized approach, and I mean ISO 31000, by the way, to addressing risk and uncertainties that will benefit the organization in 2 ways. One is to promote a culture of continual improvement as seen in, if we go back to this slide, if we go back to the previous slide, which is the framework. Now, just a moment. We go for, one is to promote a culture of continual improvement in the middle block of the framework. So we talk about the processes, so how to define that policy, how to implement the risk management. We're talking about the middle block there in this case. And the second one is that it enables the organization an opportunity to integrate other best practices implemented within the organization through a careful understanding of the context and effectively address risk through a 3-step risk assessment procedure, which is popular to many industry sectors. For example, in the case of IT service companies where information security and service management are both key factors to ensure business value to their clients, understanding the risks associated when implementing an information security protocol to a key IT service as defined in its portfolio will require a thorough and a systematic understanding of the impacts and consequences, which will help the management identify what actions or decisions to make to ensure service continuity, while at the same time protect the associated information assets from threats based on its vulnerabilities. So in principle number 5, it's simply, to keep it simple, it talks about putting things in order. And with comes order, when there's an order, there's a level of certainty and a sense of reliability that our risk data or the way we handle risks has a level of puts up a level of confidence that any top management can rely on for decision making, which is relevant to the first two principles of risk management. Now, moving on, principle 6. Risk management is based on the best available information. This picture here talks about, well, this is very popular for most stock traders, especially for those of trading on doing day trades, and has a portfolio to manage. Now, these guys are these guys, by means, they are considered high risk takers simply because if they make a wrong decision, they're going to lose a bunch. But if they make a reasonable, well predicted, well analyzed decision to sell or buy, for regardless of its results, for as long as it's correct, it can also give them a double return on the investments. So it's a high risk job, and for this type of job, it needs the most updated information possible. And when we talk about that one, the inputs of the process to the process of managing risk are based on information sources such as historical data, experience, stakeholder feedback, observation, forecasts, and expert judgment. However, decision makers should inform themselves of and should take into account any limitations of the data or modeling used or the possibility of divergence among experts. Now, in a large enterprise where strategic objectives are at a high level, making sound decisions are based on data released by reliable sources who have dedicated their years of expertise to provide their clients a level of foresight and hindsight to come up with a set of strategic goals that can be management to exercise the 4 stages of governance, or should we say how things run in an organization, from planning to acquisition and establishment, executing it and delivering it, and eventually checking, and then can be broken down into monitoring, measuring, and reviewing results based on well-assessed information, assessed risk according to the most updated information. So in this principle, it's about having the right information to make a sound decisions and, in effect, create predictable results that could provide significant return on investments and also provides benefits to the organization in particular the operational levels. Now we proceed to the 7th principle, which risk management is tailored. The inputs to the process of managing risk are based on information sources such as historical data, experience, stakeholder feedback, observation, forecasts, and expert judgment. However, decision makers should inform themselves of and should take into account any limitations of the data or modeling used or the possibility of divergence among the experts. Now, again, this should not be, I'm sorry, I have to read it again. Risk management is aligned with the organization's external and internal context and risk profile. Thus, the principle 7, that risk management is tailored. And because of the identified context within the organization, and that is found in the first part of the risk assessment process, which is identifying the context, that marks the first step of the risk assessment process. It follows that the assessment techniques treating the defined risks, generated risk registers, and the refined tactical and operational activities contributing to a riskless conformance to the business are aligned to the company's strategy. Having said these, such solutions or even the program itself may be applicable, but not exactly the entire piece of it. As contexts are unique per organization, so are its corresponding programs, regardless of which framework they have adopted. Name it, QMS, EMS, or any ISO standard, or any best practices that one company can apply for, regardless of which the context is always unique. And one reason For one reason, however, is that why ISO exists is to provide organizations an idea on how a framework must be carried out, however tuned to the company's business. And it should be that it should create value to the business and reputation across its neighbors. And which eventually you can't simply copy a risk management program to adapt it into your context and then solve risks. They are always unique. For that, it only has one program for one owner given one design, and that is principle 7 in its nature. So this principle number 8. Risk management takes human and cultural factors into account. Now, this leads us to 3 dimensions of 3 resources in enabling any practices to include risk management. And of the 3, people, processes, and technologies, of the 3, people is one of the most tangible or one of the most important resource. Now, on this picture I'm sharing you right now, this is similar to an old custom of ours known as the community spirit, or in our language, the bayanihan. This tradition is popular in the early decades, especially for newly married couples living within a community of folks with the hope of building a family. Moving a house from one community to another will require the support of everyone, carrying the small house together as a way of support. And establishing a risk management program, as well as with any business practices that are applicable to the organization, will surely require resources. Now, as I've said, that of the 3, the most important is the people, which is why, as it was mentioned earlier, that an organization's approach on risk management is as good as how the people respond to it, manifested through its culture. If we go back to the slide showing the enterprise in a nutshell, if we go back to that previous slide, or if you were able to recall it, an organization's culture is defined by its people, which is defined according to its character, that is based on his behavior to the environment, which eventually is a function of his attitude that is influenced according to the principles the man adheres to. While risk management is something that nearly everyone unconsciously do, it takes risk-oriented individuals to build a risk-oriented culture. This 9th principle is one of the most challenging principles of the 11, where it talks about transparency and inclusiveness. Well, with greater transparency comes more accountability. Now, this picture somehow seems to be a contrast in a way, but if you look at it closely, there's a story, there's a reason behind it. If we have to put you into a perspective, which I'm going to share to you now, that in this illustration, an iceberg floats depending on its foundation underneath and the area it covers on the top. As the ocean water temperature rises, and so is the environment's temperature, the more vulnerable the iceberg becomes. What makes the iceberg stable, though, and the focus on the discussion on this principle, is the mass underneath. I'm talking about what's happening underneath, the floating top that creates the foundation. Now, in a similar context, the foundation of an organization's risk management is only as good as how do they keep everyone closely involved. I mean, if in this case, if we go back to this picture, now, if we see as an iceberg representing the organization along with interested parties, how do they involve themselves, how do they are closely knit with each other, will really dictate the performance or the direction of the company. And with that reason, one tactic or one approach is to communicate and consult with them. And that is important as they make judgments about risk based on the perceptions of risk. And that they can vary because of differences in values, needs, assumptions, concepts, and the concerns of stakeholders. So you can't really imagine you sit down there talking talking to a huge crowd of different opinions, and then you just have to manage them all together. Now, as views can have a significant impact on the decisions made, the stakeholders' perceptions should be identified, recorded nonetheless, and taken into account in the decision-making process, while at the same time, if you go back to the previous principles, relying on the best available information possible. And that is how risk management is based upon too as well. Now, moving forward, because of the involvement of the stakeholders, we're expected that our risk management should be dynamic, iterative, and responsive to change. Now, the risk management continually senses and responds to change. And as uh, context changes, given that internal and external events occur, monitoring and review of the risks take place. New risks emerge, some change, and others disappear. And this picture depicts more, this picture, as you see here on the screen, depicts more of the animal's ability to adapt its surroundings and to adopt according to the changing situations. Take note of the small tagline there below the picture says, adapt then adopt. And by this case, while they sound the same, but if you look at it differently, they have different, if you look at it closely, they have different meanings. So in this context, this picture here talks about the animal's ability to adapt its surroundings and adapt to the situation as a way of either defense or an offense, or whether they are the predator or the prey in this case. In a similar fashion, though, resiliency, flexibility to changes, and iterative improvements in the system requires that the organization's ability to adapt to its surroundings and adapt according to the changing situations. And for one reason, or for such reason, that because of the changes, it is given that the 11th principle will apply, that there is a need to continuously improve the risk management processes or the risk management program. And thus the 11th principle, risk management facilitates continual improvement of the organization so that they will be able to uphold the principle that risk management is dynamic, iterative, and responsive to change. Now, this last principle reminds us of a quality philosophy developed by Masaki Imai. If you know this guy, he's the one who he's revolutionized the perspective of quality to continually strive for the better, or should we say, enabling that good change within the organization. This concept of risk management, however, is not really far from it. And as it tells basically the organization that, as we are reminded that managing risks involves everyone within the organization to explicitly address uncertainty, which involves a systematic approach using the best available information in order to deliver the desired value, while at the same time establishing it as a culture to enable continual improvement. So, keeping it simple, one doesn't stop at nothing in order to define effective resilience in a changing context. And this is a simplified message of the 11th principle. Now, of all these principles talked about, moving forward, despite the thought that we have talked about the 11 principles of risk management and then understand the context of an organization and how can they be resilient to any threats and manage risk and possible uncertainties, as we all know that when you talk about risk, it's all about dealing uncertainties in a proactive approach. Now, while the need arises, we have to keep in mind that principles are both guides and enablers. Not exactly imperatives, because that will also mean a different story. That's why there are 3 things to remember to enable an organization to implement risk management. We have principles, policies, and frameworks. Now, of the 3, the most important one is the principle. And it's a very wide context because it's not just only representing the organization, it also represents us. How we carry ourselves every day are defined according to the principles we uphold. And because it has to deal with a personal dimension, shifting cultures in a company, it will require two-way communications across all management levels and in both contexts. When we talk about context, we talk about the internal and external. And in this case, to start that whole process of changing the culture towards a risk-oriented culture, the way we wanted to see it, starting with the whole process begins at the top. And And that's why, and if you can see it in the um, if you can see it in the previous slide on the 11 principles of risk management, it is the first block of the framework. Now, as a takeaway discussion about, if we talk about making changes in a change in an enterprise, beginning with the culture, and deals with the individuals. As a last discussion, we talk about one concept by Abraham Maslow. It's talking about the hierarchy of needs. This is the last slide that I will be sharing with you, considering that when we wanted to start a change, it has to begin with one person. And for you to effectively make the change, you have to understand what makes this person do such a thing. So for that reason, everyone has its own individual need. Now, this is quite applicable and one of the most popular concepts, and it has been really effective. So it starts with the physiological safety and then the belongingness, esteem, self-actualization. But we more focus about why is it so important, because this is talking about motivation. If you want to put a principle in place, we have to keep these people motivated. To keep them motivated, we have to meet their needs. And that's why enterprises exist, because it meets the needs of every person as much as the people working inside it meets the needs of the enterprise in order to strategically expand. So it's a two-way communication, as I've said before, and everything is based on the hierarchy of needs, and that this mostly explains our priorities, and that it suggests that the basic level of needs must be met. So that also gives us an idea why organizations do exist, because eventually at the end of the day, after our work, after delivering the results, the intended results, and after managing these entire risks, it's about establishing resilience for every individual working in the place to eat and survive. And that would give us one reason why risk management frameworks do exist, in order to enable survival among individuals in a rapidly changing world. And that being said, that it is the last part. Now, I'd like to thank you guys for taking the time to listen to me, and now I'm open for the questions. Alba?
Hello, Josh. Thank you very much for
Yeah?
this very interesting presentation. We have some questions over here. We will start with the first one. The first question is, what are significant risks?
Significant risks, I have to ask further on that part, because when we talk about significant risk, from which context are we coming from? If I would have to answer that randomly, when we talk about significant risks, I can only think of three things. We talk of significant risks that are those that will create a level of uncertainty that can affect the value to the organization, and that can, in effect, compromise the costing or the costs to deliver the services or the products intended that the organization intends to perform. So if I will come in that perspective, those are my two answers. But if we come in specific perspectives, there will be definitely a different answer as to what are the significant risks.
Thank you very much. The next question is, what is an effective way of managing culture and taking all staff on board?
That's a very nice question. To effectively put them on board, you have to understand what they need. It's more about an understanding about, if you look at psychology, we know the IQ and EQ, right? We know that IQ is more on the intelligence side, or how do they understand the process. The EQ is more on the social skills. And to get them on board, it has to come with a personal dimension. It's about asking them, will this meet your need, or will this inspire you, or will it something give you some benefit if you do this for us? So if you want to keep them on board and put them cohesively, while these teams are designed or are organized to meet the needs of the top management, it should be that the top management will also provide leeways to meet the needs of these specific teams. Now, in reality, I know some organizations that it's mostly one way. It's a bottom-up approach. Well, typically it should not be, because while the people meet the benefits of the top must meet the needs of the bottom. So it's always a two-way approach. For a program to be as effective, for a program such as risk management program to be effective, the communication has to come in two ways, and both have to benefit, have to create value with each other, regardless of what value would that be. Now, in this case, if you talk about the organization, the team for the organization, it's about the team creating value to the organization, and for the organization to the members or the team involved, for them to stick together and be motivated, the organization must make all resources or allocate its resources to satisfy those needs. That's why I designed it that in this slide, the last one talks about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So it's just to give them an idea that these are the basic needs that the workers or the employees or the professionals intends to have. So I hope I get your answer your question straight.
Thank you again, Josh. The third question is, what is the best way to evaluate risk exposure and to calculate probability?
Probability is based on, probability, or how to evaluate risk exposure and how to determine probability. There are many mathematical methods actually to do that one. For the case of probability, you have to, first you have to define, you have to agree. Are you going to do agree on the scales? That means you have to agree with a certain criteria, and that criteria has to be agreed by the top management. And for the risk exposure, if we're talking about the evaluation of risk interpreted to the heat map, again, it will have to boil down on the criteria that is set by the organization. In order for because in order for that the measurements of the risk exposure and the measurements of probability will reflect the organization exactly the way exactly how they wanted to see it, the criteria must then be set according to what the organization has set, and in order that for us to be able to come up with a certain value of probability and risk exposure. Now, that being said, I can put it in two answers, possible answers. First, the criteria is again set by the organization. It just has to be translated in numerical terms. And second, while there are many possible techniques of determining probability figures or evaluating risks, determining probability again will have to be dependent on the criteria defined. So I hope I got your answer there.
Thank you, Josh. And because of the time limit, we'll just answer just one more question, which is there any list of risk which every organization must control?
There should be a list of risk that typically that is what we call the risk register. Now, this risk register is very important for the organization because this is something that has to evolve over time. Now, for companies that will have to start on implementing risk management or implement risk management program for the first time, it is important that they must be able to understand the context and then identify the risks, or identify or follow the assessment process. Eventually, as you go along, you'll be able to develop a list of what we call the risk registers. And these risk registers will be significantly useful to the organization in order for them to create strategic decisions as to how will they be defining their next business objective. And that being said, it has to be reviewed on that list of risks that contains the analytical figures, the evaluative figures, the treatment options, and the plans, the tactics, the approaches, the activities associated with every risk listed in this table, this has to be developed over time and updated as well. So there you go.
Thank you very much. You have just another question by the same man. Is that, do you agree on the use of KRI? I think
Yep.
KRI
The
means key risk indicator.
key
Yes.
results indicator. Yes, key results indicators. Um, while KRI allows the organization to evaluate the performance of the organization or evaluate the organization's risk management program, it will be a case sensitive factor. In my opinion, I agree on the use of KRI simply because it is also reflective on how the organization performs the risk management program, so that in return, how do they effectively perform the risk management program will also create an impact on the results of a risk management program. And that result of risk management program is pretty significant to the organization. So if we talk about performance-based activities to make sure that it's implemented, then KRIs has to be in place. While at the same time, KRIs can be useful also for other management standards like the QMS, EMS, and OSHAs. So for purposes of practicality, KRI is significantly useful. While at the same time, while at the same time, there should be a level of limit that has to how KRIs are used. So simplifying the answer, I agree to the use of KRIs.
Thank you, Josh, for this highly informative webinar, and I want to thank all the attendees as well who have taken time of their busy schedule to participate today. I hope and I'm sure you all have learned something new today and your questions have been answered. This webinar is also recorded and can be found on our YouTube channel. Don't forget to check back on our upcoming webinars on topics of your interest by visiting our website, PECB.com. Meet you all again same day at the same time on a topic of implementation of enterprise risk management with a risk management standard. I'm looking forward to seeing you all next week. Until then, have a great week. Thank you again, Josh.
Okay, thank you, Alba.